Hello, and we're back for another reaction video. We're looking at Brian Lagerstrom, the easiest actual good sourdough bread. No mixer. Now, just so you guys know, I've mentioned this a few times. I'm working on a video about sourdough myself. And I'm getting close. I'm through my first rough edit. I had over an hour of content for it. It's a pretty long video. Trying to get it down to less than half an hour. And I did watch Brian Lagerstrom's first sourdough video. I did watch Josh Wiseman's sourdough video. I drew a lot. Well, you'll see what it is when I get it done, but it's pretty good, I hope. So I thought it'd be nice, especially since Brian did this video two weeks ago now. 9 days ago, I guess, more specifically. I thought it'd be pretty cool to put up this reaction video to his latest iteration of sourdough before I post out my sourdough video. I thought the timing on that works out really good. So let's hit the play button and see what Brian has to say. I'm expecting this to be a pretty good video considering that he used to be a professional baker.
I was in your phone or in your TV making food videos. I was actually a restaurant chef and a professional bread baker. And today I'm going to use that experience to show you guys the easiest possible loaf of sourdough bread you can make at home. In this video, you'll learn exactly how to handle a sourdough starter, how to mix the bread dough without a stand mixer, then how to bake that dough with and without bread specific tools. If you've been wanting to dabble in the world of sourdough, but you just didn't know where to start, then this is the vid for you. Before we get started on the mix though, I really quick want to go over the 6 fundamental steps of sourdough baking so that you guys can more closely follow along. Step 1 is the leaven build stage. This is where we take our sourdough starter and turn it into the leaven that's going to ferment the dough and produce the gas necessary for a loaf of bread. By the way, leaven and sourdough starter are not the same thing, and I'll explain exactly how they're different in just a second. Step 2 is the mix stage.
So if you haven't done sourdough before, what a starter is you build your own starter to capture wild yeast. So instead of going to the store and buying a jar or the packages of yeast in the baking aisle, you are getting yeast from around us. Like there's yeast everywhere. Like you're covered in it. Your dog has yeast. Your dog has dry, flaky skin in its ear. Probably has a yeast infection. Ladies, you know what I'm talking about when I say yeast infection. Yeast everywhere. And what does yeast do? Yeast, when it eats sugar, it creates alcohol. And then it farts. And its fart is carbon dioxide. So beer, for example, alcohol and bubbly effervescence. Champagne, you take wine, you make wine and then you add a second fermentation of more yeast and then you get bubbly effervescence. It's those bubbles that we're using in the yeast to leaven bread products, the way that you would use baking soda or baking powder in a pastry. Generally, yeast has more of that savory flavor. Baking soda or powder is more neutral and used in baking pastries when you're not going to use things like egg whites as a natural leavener. So that's my little tidbit on yeast. So anyways, yeah, the sourdough starter is a way for you to capture your own yeast.
That's where we take our ripe leaven and combine it with flour, water, and salt to build the final dough. Step 3 is the bulk stage, also known as bulk fermentation. During this step, we let the sourdough cultures in the leaven digest the starches in the flour to produce acidity and CO2. This is also the part of the process where the majority of the gluten development happens, so it's important. Step 4 is the shape stage. That's where we take the blob of dough that we just fermented and fold it in a very deliberate way to actually build it into a loaf. And then step 5 is the proof stage. During proofing, we let the shaped dough capture more gas and develop more acidity. And then step 6 is the bake stage, which seems pretty straightforward, and it is, but there's a few factors that we need to pay attention to that wouldn't be obvious to the beginner baker. And that's it. There's only 6 steps in this entire process. Now, each step has its own complexity, which I'll explain as we go, but by the end of this video, you should feel more than confident in making your own loaf of sourdough at home. to build the leaven. So 12 hours before you want to mix your dough, combine 100 grams of water, that's about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, with 25 grams of ripe sourdough starter. And when I say ripe, I mean starter that was fed about 10 to 12 hours previously. So if I'm mixing this leaven at 8 p.m. Friday for Saturday morning's mix, that means that I need to feed my sourdough starter at 8 a.m. Friday morning. Finally, I'll just top the water and starter with 100 grams of bread flour, then mix until everything is well combined and there aren't any more lumps. From here, I'm going to pop on a lid and ferment this leaven at room temperature for 12 to 24 hours. Right about now, you're probably wondering, hey Bri, what is even the difference between a sourdough starter and a leaven? Well, a sourdough starter is just captured wild yeast and bacteria. You don't bake bread directly with a sourdough starter. On the other hand, a leaven is a very specific amount of flour, water, and sourdough starter that you use to produce the gas and acidity necessary to turn a dough into a loaf of bread. A sourdough starter is something that you feed and keep alive forever, whereas a leaven is made with sourdough starter and you feed it once and use all of it in the loaf. By the way, when you're baking often and you want to keep your sourdough starter alive and vigorous, I would say feed it 2 times a day, once in the morning and once at night. To feed your starter, discard all but 1 spoonful, or about 50 grams worth, then add in 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour and just stir to combine. When you're not baking that often and you just want to keep this starter alive, I would say feed it once every 7 days and then just keep it in the fridge. When you want to make some sourdough, just...
So I've actually seen some guides on the interwebs that say you can do like a double feed on your starter and then pop it in the fridge for up to 6 months. Now I've got a starter in my fridge and it's been there for about a month and a half. And it's exactly what has happened to my starter is what the article said. Like it'll split. There'll be a layer of water on the top. So I'm looking forward to reactivating my starter to see how it comes back. It did say it need a couple days of feeding. The other thing I want to say, and I'm not here to critique too much or tell everybody that what Brian's doing is wrong, but from other guides, it said an active starter, right? You can use that discard. So everything he threw in the trash when he fed his starter, that's the exact same stuff that's in the jar. So you throw it out, and in the jar you add more flour and water and mix it and feed it. Well, that's the same stuff. So you can, if you want to bake a lot and you need a lot of leaven, you throw more out than what you keep. So you take that discard, feed it, and now you've got a lot of starter to make a lot of leaven. Hey, I hate to interrupt the video, but if you're getting any value out of this, could you please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment down below.
Pull the starter out of the fridge 2 days before baking and bring it back to life with 2 feedings. Then jump into the leaven step that we did just a second ago. 12 hours after mixing, you can see this leaven is very ripe. It's 3 or 4x in size and it's frothy, bubbly, and alive. Plus it smells sweet, sour, and wild, almost like a sour beer. A quick way to test that the leaven is ready to bake with is to drop a little bit into some water. If it floats, it's ready to rip. If it sinks, that means you probably need to check the vigor of your sourdough starter. Now to make this dough, I'll grab a medium mixing bowl and drop in 275 grams of 92F water. This will ensure a warm dough temperature between 78 and 82F. Next, I'll scoop in all of my ripe leaven. Then
You should be able to get that temperature water out of your tap. Basically, all I do is I put my mixing cup, measuring cup under the tap, let it run, check it with a probe thermometer. If it's too hot, I pour some out and I start adding cold till I get the right temp.
That into the water real quick until it's kind of dissolved. Mixing already hydrated flour with fresh dry flour is kind of a pain in the butt, and this helps. Next in goes 400 grams of bread flour, then 50 grams of whole wheat flour, and 12 grams of salt. To mix it, I'll grab a sturdy spoon, then jump into the bowl and stir until the flour, water, and starter come together into a dry clump. I want to give this about...
It's funny he's using a spoon here. In his original video, he uses the best tool that Mother gave you, your hand. And he's got a bucket of water beside him and get your hand wet and then start mixing.
2 minutes of spoon mixing so that the flour can hydrate a little bit more. And once I can't mix this anymore, I'm going to switch over to the trusty soaking wet hand. Then I'll jump back in and finish mixing the dough by squeezing and folding it.
So I think the spoon mixing is new.
with my hand until everything is more or less homogeneous. The goal here is mainly to work out any clumps or dry spots. Of course, if you've got a stand mixer and you don't want to use your precious elbow grease hand mixing this, go ahead and use that instead. Just combine everything in the bowl and mix on medium speed for about 5 to 7 minutes until you've got a well combined blob. From this point, you'll follow the process exactly the same as for the hand mix. Back at the hand mix version, you can see that I've got it squeezed into a homogeneous mass, and that's all I need. From here, I'm going to cover the dough and check back in 30 minutes. Well, I take a...
So one thing that I learned as a trick when you're doing these in-between stages, there's a temperature control that you really do want to keep on your dough. If you turn the light on in your oven, have you ever wondered why those lights are so bright and get hot? I don't know if this is actually their intended purpose, but they do work good for this. They will keep your oven at about 85, somewhere between 80 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the perfect temperature for fermenting bread. So if you turn the oven light on and throw your stuff in there, you will get you'll get the right environment for fermenting, which caused quite a bit of scheduling conflict when I was baking breads for my sourdough video, because my wife would want to bake dinner, or roast dinner, put dinner in the oven, while I have bread in the oven for 6 hours or something. So I ended up getting a fermentation station, I don't know, just like an insulated bag. It's an insulated bag. It folds flat almost. It's an insulated bag, and it's got a heat pad in it and a very precise thermostat. So you could dial in. I dialed it in the temperature I wanted, and I did that on the counter so I could give her back the oven. It wasn't. I bought the cheapest one that I could find on Amazon, because I thought, if I never bake bread again after I do the sourdough video, because I was baking bread for about 8 or 9 weeks to get it right, then, so be it. It was $30. And if I enjoy it and I'm going to do more, then, hey, I have this, and I can use it till it dies and stops working. And then I can invest in a nicer one. And I'm somewhere in the middle, because actually Heather asked me 3 or 4 weeks ago. She said, hey, how long would it take you to whip up one of your famous sourdough loaves? And I said, 4 days. You want sourdough in 4 days? I got to pull the starter out of the fridge, feed it for a couple days, and then 2 days of sourdough process. And she's like, yeah, I kind of thought you were going to tell me you could have one ready for tomorrow. Never mind. Anyways, let's get back to this.
30 minutes later, this dough is still a wet, shaggy mess, so we'll need to develop some of the gluten. To do that, I'll grab a grip of the dough, pull it out until I meet resistance, then I'll fold it back over itself. I'll repeat that 5 to 6 more times until I can't pull and fold anymore. Then I'll flip this dough over and give it a 10 o'clock to 3 o'clock rounding maneuver to tuck the dough under itself and create even more strength and tension. This is actually super close to how we would develop the gluten in a professional bread bakery. Instead of relying on a stand mixer to do 100% of the gluten development, we're actually layering the gluten or folding it to develop it. This is just a much gentler way to develop gluten, and in my opinion, it's more effective. So you don't really need a stand mixer. And once this dough's been folded and rounded into a tight little ball, I'm going to cover it again and check back in 30 more minutes. 30 minutes later, or 60 minutes after we mix this dough, I'm going to repeat this folding one more time, exactly the same as before. Now I'm going to cover it one more time and move it to a warm place to finish its bulk fermentation for 2 more hours.
See, now he waited a bit to throw it into the oven. That's fine. I mean, this is his recipe, so if I were making it, if I wanted to, I would do even though I've been baking sourdough for a bit now, I would follow this to the T the first time and then start tweaking. Well, I liked this other recipe's technique here, or I just enjoyed doing this here, because the slap and folds or the rhubarb method, some of it can get really tedious on your hand. And if you can find a recipe where you can skip some of it, like Brian showing you when you can use the mixer here. If you can skip some of that, it will save your wrist.
In the bulk, 3 hours in total. By the way, my warm place is just my oven, which I turned on for about 5 minutes, then turned off, so now it's sitting around 95F. Now, while this dough finishes bulk fermenting in a warm place, I want to call out one of the most common mistakes that most sourdough bread bakers make, which is dough temperature. If your dough is below about 76 F, it's just not gonna ferment properly. It's gonna take all day and you're gonna be constantly checking it and being like, what's going on? Your dough's too cold. So there's two main ways to mitigate this. One is use warm water up front like we did. I would recommend at least 92 F if you want to end up with a dough temperature between 76 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And then number two is make sure you're fermenting the dough in the proper environment. In a warm place like we just did in the oven is a great way to ensure that it keeps moving. Or if you're not going to be throwing it into an oven, at the very least, make sure that it's in a warm room and not on a stone countertop. Stone countertops act as kind of a heat sink and they suck all of the heat energy out of the dough through the bottom of the bowl. So I like to ferment my dough on a wood cutting board so that all the heat energy stays in the dough and it ferments nice and fast. 2 hours later, when I pull my dough out of the oven, you can see that it's just about doubled in size and it's looking nice and gassy. From here, I'm gonna move into the shape phase. For that, I'll flip my dough out onto a lightly floured cutting board, then I'm gonna give it the simplest possible shape. For that, I'll grab opposite sides of the dough, pull out and fold them over each other. Then I'll rotate a bit, pull out 2 more sides and fold those over. Next, I'll flip it over onto the folds and then round it while stretching the top down and under the bottom to create just a little bit more tension. This shape of bread is called a boule, B-O-U-L-E, and it's by far the easiest shape that you can make at home. Next, I'll grab a linen-lined bread proofing basket and sprinkle the inside with a moderate amount of flour to keep the loaf from sticking.
So yeah, these are a thing. I don't have any yet. They're not expensive. You buy a kit, it comes with all kinds of stuff. I just used mixing bowls with a tea towel inside. And he's using flour. Josh Wiseman's video from like 4 or 5 years ago on sourdough, he recommends rice flour for this. I don't know why. I will tell you, with the tea towels that I used, there was a weave in them, and it imparted that weave that to press that into the sourdough while it was fermenting in there. And it gave a texture to the dough. It looked pretty cool. So, like, you can experiment with different clean towels. But if you've got some towels that have a pattern in them, put that in your bowl and press down and just give it a gentle, like, I'm not even saying just drop it in. Let it just drop it. Let its weight, gravity, Isaac Newton, let that do the work for you. And when you pull it out, it's going to have some of that in there. It looks pretty decent. Looks nice.
By the way, if you're even a little bit bread curious and you plan to bake more than a couple of times per year, definitely get some proofing baskets. You can get a set of 2 on Amazon for like 25 bucks, and if you're interested, I'll link to these ones in the description. Next, I'll drop my shaped boule into the floured basket, seam side up, then I'll come back and give the backside a few more crisscross folds to pull the glutens in the loaf into just a little bit more tension. If you don't have or aren't going to buy a bread proofing basket, use a 9 to 10 inch wide bowl and drop in a less absorbent fabric like canvas, linen, or a tea towel, then dust with flour and drop in your loaf. Next, I'll cover up the back.
All right, it actually is pretty funny because every time I pause the video to say something, 30 seconds later, Brian says it. I find this to be hilarious. Also, here's a tip for you. If, maybe you go to a restaurant a lot, you have a relationship with somebody in the food industry, those stainless mixing bowls, there's one brand. There's a couple different brands that exist. There's tons of brands, but for example, I'm in Canada. My restaurant, we use GFS a lot for our food orders, and they also sell equipment. And there's 2 different brands: there's Vollrath and Brownie. Those are their 2 different main brands that they have. They can't have all the brands, obviously, right? The Vollrath stuff's a little expensive. There's some stuff I won't cheap out on, like the Vollrath tongs are $11. I have 30 pairs of those in the restaurant, in the kitchen, right? I have 2 pairs at home. The Brownie tongs are like $4.99, and they have an awful pinch point on them. You can pinch your hand. The springs are too heavy. They look the same, but they're not. They don't grab food the same way either. So, but the Brownie bowls are so much, and they're a lot thinner than the Vollrath bowls. but they're so much cheaper. So if you happen to have a good rapport with a restaurant that, say, hey, could you order me some brownie bowls through your supplier? And I got myself, I think it was like $25. I got myself an 18-inch bowl. I got myself a 12-inch bowl. I got myself 2 8s. No, I got 2 12s, 2 8s, and a 6. Like I saw the listings available, and I clicked, one of each on the 2 biggest, 2 of each on the middle sizes, and then 1 on the itty bitty one. And I think it was like $25 or $30, and I got myself like a full set of commercial grade bowls. Now they are thinner than the Vollrath ones. If you're prone to dropping stuff a lot, you're going to end up denting them. But for $25,
side of my loaf, then scoot it back over to a warm place to proof up for 60 to 90 minutes. After about 60 to 70 minutes of proofing, when I pull this loaf out of the oven, you can see it's about 60 to 70% larger and it's filling out the basket nicely. To test if it's ready to bake, I'll poke it gently. If the loaf bounces back slowly, like the Pillsbury Doughboy, it's perfectly proofed. If the indent stays indented, that means that your loaf is probably overproofed. And that's fine, it just means that it won't rise as high in the oven. Just give it less time next time. Now, the most low-tech and simple process for baking this is to flip the loaf out onto a parchmented sheet tray, then grab scissors and score the top with 5 to 6 deliberate overlapping snips. These cuts create a weak spot that allows the bread to spring much higher in the oven. Next, I'll grab a squirter of water and spritz this loaf about 10 times to create some extra steam during the bake. Then I'll cover with a turkey foil pan lid and load into a preheated 450F oven and bake covered for 15 minutes. By the way, this lid is essential for this process because it traps steam around the outside of the loaf. Steam is important for good bread for 2 main reasons. Number 1 is that it delays crust formation, so it allows the loaf to rise a lot higher. And then number 2, it changes the way the outside of the crust gelatinizes, so we get a more dynamic, crunchier, and more golden brown crust. 15 minutes later, when I come back and remove the lid, you can see that we got an epic oven spring and we've got a really beautiful, craggy opening up top. From here, I'm going to bake this loaf uncovered for 20 more minutes, but I'm going to scoot it onto a wire rack to keep the bottom from burning. And after 30-ish minutes of bake time, when I pull this out, you can see that this loaf...
So that wire rack, so I know what he's saying about the bottom burning because it's going to be directly on the sheet pan. If you ever study like classical food theory, when you roast things, everything's supposed to be roasted like that. Actually, like if you look at textbooks, they'll actually show pictures of you put like a drip pan on the shelf underneath where you're roasting, and you'd put your roast directly on just the rack of the oven. So you got to pull them out and clean them quite often if you do that. And what happens though, especially here too, is you get air movement around the entire product. Because if you just put that down on the sheet pan, you get like a sear effect. And that's what he's talking about, not overcooking it. So you're going to get more even cooking because you're going to get airflow underneath the bread as well.
Loaf looks craggy, crusty, and nicely golden brown. But there is a second method for baking that's just as easy as this one and provides a much better crust experience. To do it, I'll pull a Dutch oven that I preheated at 475F for 30 minutes out of the oven, then hit a 9-inch round of parchment paper with some semolina flour. Then I'll carefully flip my proof loaf onto that parchment. Then I'll grab my scissors one more time and snip this loaf 5 to 6 times on an angle. Then I'm going to lift this parchment carefully and drop it into the heated Dutch oven. Then I'll pop on the preheated lid, then drop the whole thing into the oven and bake covered for 15 minutes. By the way, I greatly prefer the Dutch oven method here over the sheet tray foil pan because Dutch ovens have a lot more thermal mass. What does that mean? Well, the cast iron holds onto a lot more heat and it transfers that into the dough a lot more efficiently. Aesthetically, that means that we get a thicker, more set, crispier crust and a more dynamic golden brown exterior. And after 15 minutes, I'm going to snatch this Dutchie.
I've only ever baked sourdough in the Dutch oven. I haven't used the sheet pan before.
The oven, pop off the lid and release the steam. Wow, as you can see, this loaf ripped itself open in the oven. Okay, the Dutch goes back into my 475F oven and I'll bake it for another 25 more minutes. And after about a 35-minute bake, it's time to pull this loaf and take a look. As you can see, it's beautifully risen, and it exhibits almost every single shade of golden brown known to man. You've got fields of wheat, wet sand, mahogany, oat milk latte, ooh, and my favorite, leather wallet. Honestly, this is a pretty wonderful result for such a simple process, and I think any sourdough beginner would be mega stoked to open up this loaf and take a bite. It's crusty, it's sour, it's toasty, and it's full of boozy wheat flavor. I really hope this video inspires you guys to finally give sourdough baking a try, or maybe it'll point some of you guys on the sourdough struggle bus in the right direction, and you can finally have your first successful loaf. If you want to learn how to make your own sourdough,
that was actually pretty good. It was nice and short. Explained a few of the technical aspects between difference of a starter and a levain. I like how. So if you watch his first video, when he does the levain, he uses the entire starter. He uses the entire starter. He's got a separate video on starter, I think, or it's one. I can't remember if it's one video or if he breaks it into two. But you've got the Brian starter, okay, and then you turn the whole starter into levain, and then he says you pull out. I think it's say like 200 grams, and it's like there should be 25 grams left over to make starter with. But when I tried baking it, I never had enough starter left over. It got pretty, like it was getting really dicey. So I started making, the day before I would make a Brian style. I would follow his recipe. I would take my discard and make a second starter because I knew there wasn't quite enough left over. You have to be so precise with your measurements and with spatulaing out to get it. It just was too difficult. So that's a pretty big improvement on this method over his first recipe. And the bread looked amazing. I would love to eat me some of that bread. I love bread, and that's a weak point of mine. You know, it's the carbs, the calories, the just throwing it in there. Anyways, I digress. If you enjoyed watching this video and my commentary, my reaction on some Brian Lagerstrom, let me know. If you hated it, let me know too. You know, you either liked me by this point or you want to punch me in the face. So you can let me know one way or the other down below. Thanks for watching. For this week, I've been Chef James MacInnis.